Ashwood Manor lay on the edge of the moors, a sprawling estate of grey stone and ivy, weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Its turrets and high windows looked down on the village like a brooding sentinel, keeping its secrets locked behind thick walls. The locals rarely went near it except for deliveries. Even then, they hurried away as if the place exhaled a chill. And so, when news broke that tragedy had struck the household, the whispers spread quickly. An unsolvable crime, they said. One even the constable could not make sense of. It began on a night of heavy fog, when the lamps on the manor's long drive glowed faintly like drowning stars. Lady Margaret Ashwood, the widow who had lived there alone since her husband's passing 2 years prior, had rung for her maid shortly after dinner. But when the maid entered, she found her mistress sitting rigid in the drawing-room, staring at the hearth as though turned to stone. The fire had burned low. At her feet lay a pool of dark blood, and across her lap rested an ornate letter-opener, its handle carved in the shape of a serpent. Her eyes were open, wide and unseeing. The physician later confirmed what the maid already knew: Lady Margaret Ashwood was dead. Yet the manner of her death raised questions that grew thornier with each passing hour. The wound was peculiar, a single, clean puncture beneath the collarbone, too precise, the doctor insisted, for an act of self-harm. But there had been no sign of struggle, no forced entry, and all the windows and doors to the drawing-room were locked from within. The only key to the door had been discovered in the lock, on the inside. The maid swore she had heard nothing unusual, save for the faint strike of the clock on the landing. And still, Lady Margaret was dead. Murdered, or so it appeared, in a room no one could have entered or left. The constable did his best, questioning the household of 5 servants. Their stories aligned neatly. Dinner had been taken at 7:30. Lady Margaret dismissed them as usual, retiring to the drawing-room with her customary glass of port. No one entered thereafter until the maid found her lifeless at 8:30. The cook swore she had not left the kitchen. The butler had been polishing the silver in the pantry, with the footman helping him. The housemaid was upstairs in the linen room. All insisted their innocence with trembling conviction. The constable, flustered, declared it a damnable business, and sent word for a proper detective. What puzzled everyone was the single, inexplicable clue. On the mantelpiece above the cold fire, a sheet of paper had been propped against a porcelain clock. Written in Lady Margaret's neat, slanted hand was a single line: "The serpent will return to its nest." Nothing more. No signature, no explanation. The words were underlined twice, as if in urgency. The letter opener, shaped like a serpent, its blade slick with her blood, seemed a deliberate, mocking echo of the note. Yet if Lady Margaret had written it herself, when had she done so? Before her death, in warning, or after, coerced somehow? The handwriting was hers, beyond doubt. The constable muttered about riddles and old superstitions, but he could not shake the feeling that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make the crime appear insoluble. The villagers offered their own theories. Some said Lady Margaret had been haunted by her late husband, Lord Henry, whose sudden death in India remained shrouded in rumor. Others whispered about debts and long-forgotten quarrels, suggesting she had many enemies beyond the manor walls. But none of these tales explained how a murderer could vanish from a locked room, leaving behind only an ominous line on a piece of paper and a bloodied serpent in the widow's lap. By the next morning, the case had drawn the attention of Inspector Archer, a man with a reputation for patience and an eye for the peculiar detail. He arrived at Ashwood Manor in a long coat, his boots slick with mud from the drive, and began his quiet, methodical survey. He observed the drawing-room first, kneeling to examine the rug where the blood had seeped. The serpent-handled letter opener he studied without touching, then motioned for it to be wrapped carefully and preserved. He leaned over the mantelpiece, scrutinizing the note. His brow furrowed. She underlined it twice, he murmured to himself. A warning, or a message meant for someone specific. The servants hovered uneasily as Archer worked. He asked them to recount their movements again, not with the constable's brusque impatience, but with calm precision. He noted their hesitations, their glances toward one another, the cracks in their rehearsed certainty. The butler, for all his dignified bearing, seemed strained when asked about the master's death abroad. The cook's hands trembled more than one would expect. The maid who had found the body avoided his eyes. Archer filed these details away without comment. The locked room itself presented the greatest riddle. Archer examined the key, turning it over in his gloved hand. It was old, heavy of brass, worn smooth at the edges. If the door was locked from the inside, he said softly, then either she locked it herself after admitting her killer, or the killer never left. His gaze swept the chamber, resting on the tall cabinets, the heavy drapes, the shadows between furniture. He tapped the wainscoting, pressed at the window panes, even crouched to peer at the narrow grate in the hearth. Nothing yielded an answer. The air in the room grew heavier, as though the house itself resisted giving up its secrets. By evening, the inspector had gathered little more than fragments. The cryptic message, the serpent-handled weapon, the locked room with no escape. Yet already his instincts told him the crime was neither simple nor accidental. Someone had planned it with a careful hand, weaving the appearance of impossibility as a cloak to conceal their true purpose. But who would benefit from Lady Margaret's death? And why cloak the act in such elaborate mystery, unless the message itself was the heart of the matter? As darkness fell again over Ashwood Manor, Archer stood at the threshold of the drawing-room, looking back once more at the widow's chair, now empty but still marked by the memory of her rigid form. The silence of the manor pressed in, broken only by the faint creak of timbers and the distant hoot of an owl on the moors. A crime had been committed, one that defied ordinary explanation, yet demanded one nonetheless. And in the cryptic words on the mantelpiece, Archer felt certain lay the key to unraveling it. The serpent will return to its nest. Inspector Archer returned to the drawing-room the following morning with the kind of quiet resolve that unnerved the household. The fog had lifted from the moors, leaving the sky washed in pale grey light, but the manor seemed no less heavy with shadows. He moved with deliberate calm, pausing at the doorway as if to take in the entire chamber anew, not merely as a crime scene, but as a living puzzle that might yet betray its secret. The constable had already begun his routine, measuring distances, noting times in a ledger, interviewing the servants for the third time. Archer listened politely, nodding when addressed, but his gaze never lingered on the obvious. Instead, his eyes drifted across the details no one else had considered. The angle of a chair leg scuffed against the carpet, a faint impression on the arm of the sofa, the thin trail of ash leading from the hearth to the edge of the rug. He crouched by the grate, brushing the ash with a gloved fingertip. It was not coal ash alone. Paper had been burned here recently. The constable mentioned nothing of it in his notes, and Archer made no comment, merely brushing the soot from his gloves before moving on. His attention shifted to the mantelpiece once more. The porcelain clock ticked softly, the note propped against it unchanged, but beneath the clock's base, Archer noticed a fine line of dust disturbed. The clock had been moved, slightly, deliberately, perhaps to place the note beneath it or to conceal something. He resisted the urge to lift it at once, preferring to let his suspicions ripen with the rest of his observations. The butler, Mr. Grayson, entered with stiff formality, carrying a tray of tea. His hands trembled only faintly, but enough for Archer to notice. "You are kind, Mr. Grayson," Archer said evenly, accepting a cup. "It must be difficult keeping the house in order after such a loss." The butler inclined his head, but the inspector's words seemed to press on him like weight. He murmured something about duty and withdrew, yet Archer's eye followed him until the door closed. There was something in the man's manner, a wariness not of grief but of caution, as if every step he took was measured against an invisible danger. Archer turned next to the servants' recollections, taking them one by one in the morning room, where the pale light softened their anxious faces. The cook spoke first, repeating her claim that she had been in the kitchen all evening. Archer asked her what she had cooked for dinner, and she recited the menu without hesitation. But when pressed on whether Lady Margaret had eaten much, her voice faltered. She said she had not noticed. The inspector merely nodded, though he marked the hesitation carefully. The footman, young Thomas, fidgeted under Archer's calm gaze. He repeated his story of helping polish the silver with the butler. But when Archer casually inquired what piece of silver he polished last, Thomas stumbled over the answer, naming a candelabrum before correcting himself to a salver. The inconsistency was slight, easily dismissed by another, yet Archer caught the slip and tucked it away like a coin in his pocket. The housemaid, Ellen, was pale, her hands twisting at her apron. She described discovering Lady Margaret's body with the flat tone of one who had told the story too often already. Yet Archer noticed how her eyes flickered toward the window when he asked if she had seen or heard anything unusual. "Only the clock, sir," she said quickly. The one on the landing struck the half-hour. But her glance toward the window betrayed something unspoken. Did she see someone outside? Or did she fear he would ask? By the time Archer had dismissed them all, a pattern had begun to take shape, not of guilt, not yet, but of concealment. Each servant, in small ways, had bent their story to fit, like boards hammered into place over a hole in the floor. None of their deceptions were blatant, but together they formed a lattice of misdirection, as though every one of them had something, however small, they dared not reveal. Archer returned to the drawing-room in solitude. He circled it slowly, like a hunter waiting for his quarry to stir. At last he returned to the mantel, where the porcelain clock stood sentinel over the widow's cryptic message. He lifted it carefully, and beneath its base he found exactly what he had suspected: a small brass key, tarnished but intact. It was not the key to the drawing-room, too small for that. He examined it under the window's light, his eyes narrowing. A cabinet key, perhaps, or a drawer. Why had it been hidden here, unless it unlocked something that Lady Margaret, or her killer, wished to conceal? He replaced the clock and slipped the key into his pocket. His eyes then caught another detail he had overlooked before: the position of the letter opener. It had lain across Lady Margaret's lap, bloodied, but on the carpet beneath the chair he now saw the faintest smear, as though the weapon had been set down there briefly before being placed in her hands. A staged tableau. Someone wanted the death to speak in symbols, not in truth. The serpent, the cryptic note, the locked room, too elaborate to be the product of impulse. That afternoon, the coroner confirmed Archer's suspicion that the wound was unusually precise. A thrust delivered with knowledge of anatomy, angled upward to pierce the heart swiftly. Not the wild strike of a servant panicking, nor the clumsy effort of an intruder. This was calculated, efficient, and deeply personal. Archer stood in the hall, looking up at the portrait of Lord Henry Ashwood in military dress. His painted eyes seemed to follow every passerby with stern command. Rumour said his death abroad had been sudden, whispered to involve treachery, though no proof had ever come home with his body. The inspector studied the portrait for a long time, then turned to the butler, who lingered nearby. "Tell me, Mr. Grayson," Archer said softly, "do you believe your mistress feared anyone?" The butler stiffened, his lips tightening. "She was a woman of reserve, sir. If she feared anything, she kept it close." Archer let the silence stretch, watching the man's composure strain under its weight. Then he gave a faint smile and walked on, leaving the butler standing in the shadow of his master's portrait. By evening, the inspector had pieced together enough to be certain of one thing. Someone in Ashwood Manor had lied to him. Perhaps not about the act itself, but about the moments surrounding it. The burned paper in the grate, the misplaced silver, the hidden key, the staged weapon, all pointed toward careful deception. Yet the final shape of it remained elusive, like a figure glimpsed in fog. As he prepared to leave the drawing-room once more, Archer paused at the window where Ellen's glance had lingered. The fog had returned, drifting over the moors. He opened the latch and pushed gently. The casement did not budge. It was locked tight, the mechanism stiff with age. And yet, at the sill, faint but undeniable, lay the trace of mud. A footprint, small, narrow, pressed into the wood before the fog's damp had dried. The room had not been as sealed as everyone insisted. Someone had been at the window, perhaps even passed through it. But who and why and how they had locked it again were questions that would not yet resolve. Still, it was enough to tilt the balance. The impossibility of Lady Margaret's death had cracked, and through that crack Archer glimpsed the first glimmer of truth. The serpent's nest was not sealed as tightly as it seemed, and within Ashwood Manor, deception coiled in silence, waiting for him to uncover it. The morning after his discovery at the window, Inspector Archer gathered the household once more, but this time not in the drawing-room or morning-room, where routine had already set a pattern. He chose the library, a dim and heavy chamber lined with shelves of leather, bound volumes, its tall windows filtering the weak sunlight through faded curtains. He wished to unsettle them, to break the rhythm of their practiced retellings. When they entered one by one, their unease was clear. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, and the room's silence seemed designed for confessions. He began with Ellen, the housemaid, who clutched her apron as though it were armor. She repeated her account of finding Lady Margaret, her words almost identical to before. But Archer leaned forward gently, lowering his voice. "You said you heard the landing clock strike the half-hour. Yet, when I examined the mechanism, I found it had not been wound for days. Are you certain of what you heard?" The girl's lips parted, her breath catching. She looked down quickly, her hands twisting. I must have been mistaken, sir. Perhaps it was another clock." "Perhaps," Archer said softly. He allowed the silence to deepen before asking, "And why did you glance toward the window when you denied hearing anything else? Did you see someone outside?" Ellen's face drained of color. She shook her head too quickly. "No, sir. Only the fog." Her denial rang with the thinness of paper, but she would say no more. Archer let her go, making note not only of her words but of the fear that drove them. The cook was next, stout Mrs. Bridger, her cheeks ruddy and eyes wary. She came prepared with a litany of her movements, delivered in a rush, as though hoping the torrent of words would leave no space for suspicion. She described peeling potatoes, checking the stock, even scolding the scullery boy for idling. Archer listened without interruption until she faltered, realizing she had given him too much detail. He asked only one question. "You said Lady Margaret ate sparingly. How could you know that, if you never left the kitchen?" The woman froze. Her lips pressed together, then parted again. "I ask Ellen afterwards, sir." "That's what I meant." But her eyes slid away from his, and Archer knew the answer was contrived. She had seen Lady Margaret after all, or had wished him to believe she had not. Thomas, the footman, entered next, his youthful face pale, his hands restless. He sat stiffly, staring straight ahead as though discipline alone would shield him. Archer asked him again about the silver he polished with Mr. Grayson. This time Thomas answered with certainty, naming the salver first, without hesitation. Too certain, Archer thought. A rehearsed correction, born from fear of his earlier slip. "Tell me, Thomas," Archer said casually, "when you carried the tray to Lady Margaret after dinner, did she say anything to you?" The boy's head jerked. I didn't carry it, sir. That was the butler's duty." Archer murmured. "And yet I found a smear of polish on the door handle to the drawing room. Not the kind a butler leaves, but the sort left by hands still new to the task." Thomas swallowed hard, his silence answering more than words. Archer dismissed him, watching the boy stumble out of the library like a rabbit escaping the hounds. Then came Mr. Grayson, the butler, composed as always, his dark suit immaculate, his manner grave. He bowed slightly before taking his seat. Archer regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You were with Lady Margaret longer than you admit, I think. Why conceal it?" Grayson's jaw tightened, though his voice remained level. "I served her port, as was my duty. I left at once afterward. There was nothing to conceal." Archer's eyes narrowed. "And yet the port decanter bore fingerprints not only of your right hand, but your left as well, smeared across the glass, as if you had lifted it in haste. You lingered, Mr. Grayson. Long enough for what? A word with your mistress? A quarrel?" For the first time, the butler's composure cracked. His eyes flickered toward the shelves, then back to Archer. "We spoke briefly, yes. But it was only of household matters. She was restless, I thought. Distracted. What distracted her?" He hesitated, and in the pause Archer sensed a decision being weighed. But the butler chose silence, bowing his head slightly as though in penance. "I cannot say, sir." Archer let him go with a faint smile, for silence was as telling as speech. Last came Mrs. Bridger's kitchen ally, a scullery boy sent up reluctantly. He was hardly more than 12, with hair sticking up in tufts and dirt beneath his nails. Archer did not press him as he had the others, but simply asked what he had seen that night. The boy shifted, glancing toward the door as if fearing reprisal. I was outside, sir, in the yard," he whispered. "And I thought I saw someone at the drawing-room window. But when I told cook, she cuffed me and said it was nonsense." Archer's heart quickened, though he kept his expression calm. "Describe what you saw." "A shadow, sir. Tall. Stood there a bit, then gone when I looked again. But the fog was thick." That scrap of honesty, born of fear but too crude to be false, fit with the muddy print Archer had found. He dismissed the boy kindly, then stood alone in the library, his mind knitting together the threads of deception. Ellen denied what her eyes had betrayed. The cook had offered too much detail, then stumbled on a lie. Thomas rehearsed his answers, shaping them to fit what he thought Archer wanted to hear. The butler admitted to speaking with Lady Margaret, but concealed the subject. And the boy, the least likely witness, spoke of a figure outside the very window that bore the telltale mark. Each voice had offered not truth, but fragments of a puzzle, each shaded by fear, loyalty, or guilt. Archer did not yet know whose hand had driven the serpent's blade, but he knew one thing with certainty. Lady Margaret's death was not the act of an intruder from the fog. It was born within Ashwood Manor, its roots deep in the lives of those who served her. And among their carefully woven lies, one would unravel first, dragging the rest with it. That night, as the lamps guttered low and the manor settled into uneasy silence, Archer walked the corridors alone, listening to the house breathe. Every creak of timber, every whisper of the wind through the eaves seemed to carry the weight of deception. Somewhere in these walls, the serpent had coiled itself, and it would strike again if he did not unmask it soon. Inspector Archer spent the next day immersed in the tangle of lives knotted within Ashwood Manor, each servant's words echoing in his mind like threads waiting to be woven. The widow's death had left no straightforward path, only a maze of motives, each leading in conflicting directions. To navigate it, Archer returned again and again to the simplest question: who stood to gain? But at Ashwood, gain was measured in more than inheritance. The solicitor had already confirmed that Lady Margaret's estate was large, but not boundless. A portion would be sold to settle lingering debts from her husband's ventures abroad, while the rest, by will, passed chiefly to distant relatives she had scarcely written to in years. None of the household would inherit directly. Yet Archer knew well that money rarely flowed only through legal channels. Service in a house like this often meant reliance on the mistress's favor, gifts, gratuities, even promises of security. Lady Margaret, he suspected, held those strings tightly. Who among them feared their string might be cut? Mr. Grayson, the butler, had served the family the longest. His loyalty, by all appearances, was ironclad. Yet Archer had noticed the wary bitterness behind his careful words, the way he stiffened whenever Lord Henry's name surfaced. There were rumors in the village that Grayson had once expected more than service from the Ashwoods, that Lady Margaret had relied on him deeply after her husband's death, perhaps too deeply before cooling and dismissing his quiet devotion. If true, such wounded pride could fester into resentment. The cook, Mrs. Bridger, had her own grievance. She had grown accustomed to Lady Margaret's generosity in the early years of her widowhood. Extra pay, leniency, gifts of clothing and wine. But lately that tide had ebbed. Lady Margaret, by the butler's account, had grown severe with expenses, scrutinizing every order. More than once the cook had been reprimanded for waste. For a woman who ruled her kitchen like a kingdom, the loss of favor must have felt like exile. Ellen, the housemaid, carried herself with the pale nervousness of one who bore secrets too heavy for her years. Archer recalled her frightened glance toward the window, her denial too brittle to believe. Perhaps she had seen someone that night, someone she wished to protect. Her fear might not be guilt of her own making, but the fear of betraying another. Loyalty, he knew, could be as strong a motive as hatred. Thomas, the footman, had stumbled and lied over trivial matters, which often betrayed the heavier truth beneath. He was young, ambitious, perhaps desperate to secure his place in the household. Archer learned from a discreet inquiry in the village that Thomas had been seen more than once in the company of Ellen. A secret courtship, no doubt. If Lady Margaret had discovered it and disapproved, as she surely would, both might have feared dismissal. The prospect of losing livelihood, home, and future could drive even the meekest hearts toward desperate acts. And then there was Lady Margaret herself. Her note, "The serpent will return to its nest," hung over the case like a riddle of her own making. Who was the serpent? Her husband. Someone from her past come home to roost. Or did she use the symbol for one within the manor, a betrayal coiled close at hand? Archer paced the drawing room once more, his keen eyes darting from object to object. He thought of the small brass key hidden beneath the clock, its purpose still obscure. Somewhere in this house was the locket fit, and within that lock perhaps lay the truth of Lady Margaret's final days. Until he found it, motives remained only shadows on the wall. That evening he summoned the household once more, though not to question them outright. Instead, he invited them to sit together in the dining room, under the silent gaze of the long portraits lining the walls. He spoke little, merely observing them in the strained quiet. The cook glowered at the footman's fidgeting. The maid kept her eyes fixed on her hands, while Thomas stole glances at her when he thought no one noticed. Grayson stood apart, stiff as a sentinel, his gaze moving from one to the other with the measured calm of a man guarding a secret. Archer did not miss how Ellen flinched whenever Grayson's eyes rested on her. The meal passed in uneasy silence. When it ended, Archer rose and thanked them, then departed without further word. He had not sought confessions, only the frictions revealed when people who lied were forced to share the same air. And what he saw was clear. Ellen feared the butler, Thomas protected Ellen, the cook resented them both, and Grayson tolerated none of it. A household divided, each with reason enough to wish the mistress gone, or to protect the one who had made her so. Later, alone in the library, Archer unlocked drawers and cabinets with the ring of household keys lent by Grayson. None matched the small brass key in his pocket. It was only when he tried a narrow cabinet built into the wall behind the writing desk that the key slipped neatly into place. Inside lay a bundle of letters bound with a ribbon, their paper yellowed but the ink sharp. They were addressed to Lady Margaret from her husband during his time in India, full of affectionate words, but with a darker undercurrent. Lord Henry had written of debts, of threats from unnamed men, of betrayal among his associates. The final letter, the one nearest her death, carried only a single line: "The serpent coils even in our own house." Archer's pulse quickened. The serpent again. The same symbol Lady Margaret had scrawled before her death. She had not invented it in her final hour. It had haunted her long before. Her husband's words, her own fears, both pointed to an enemy not of foreign soil but within these very walls. Yet the question remained: who? The butler, wounded in pride, perhaps carrying knowledge of old betrayals. The cook, embittered by loss of favor. The young lovers, desperate to conceal their secret at any cost. Each motive alone could justify suspicion, yet none explained the locked room, the staged tableau, the message left behind. Greed, revenge, jealousy, fear, all coiled together, forming a knot impossible to untangle by reason alone. Archer stood at the window, staring out into the fog, the letters heavy in his hand. He saw then that this was no crime born of a single cause. It was a web, each thread tugging another, until Lady Margaret's death became inevitable. To solve it, he would not need merely to find the killer's hand, but to unpick the entire tapestry of lies binding Ashwood Manor. And already he sensed the truth, that the serpent was not one among them, but all of them, each complicit in ways they could scarcely admit even to themselves. The hour grew late, but Archer did not retire. He sat at the writing desk, spreading the letters before him, charting connections as if mapping a battlefield. By the time the clock struck midnight, he had no single suspect to accuse, but a maze of motives winding ever tighter around the widow's death. Somewhere in that maze lay the path to the heart of the matter, and he would walk it, step by step, until the serpent showed its head. The letters discovered in the locked cabinet gave the investigation its first solid anchor, and by the following day the manor hummed with whispers of progress. The constable, flushed with satisfaction, wasted no time in drawing conclusions. To him, the matter was plain. Lady Margaret's death was tied directly to the serpent her late husband had warned of, and the serpent could be none other than Grayson, the butler who had stood at her side for decades. It seemed neat enough. Grayson had admitted to lingering with his mistress on the night of her death. He had access to the drawing room, to the letter opener itself, and the strength and composure to carry out such a swift, precise act. His silence about the subject of his final conversation with Lady Margaret appeared damning. And now, with the letters in Archer's possession, the constable argued that Grayson's motive was clear. His pride had curdled into resentment after years of service unacknowledged. Lady Margaret had discovered his resentment, perhaps even accused him outright, and he had struck in the heat of betrayal, cloaking his act with a cryptic message borrowed from her husband's words. The constable pressed for an arrest before the day was out. The villagers, always eager for resolution, accepted the tale with morbid relish. "The serpent has been found," they muttered to one another, half in relief, half in smug certainty. The manor's servants shrank from Grayson as though guilt clung to him visibly, and even the cook crossed herself when he entered the kitchen. But Archer did not share their certainty. He listened in silence as the constable recited his case, nodding at the points made. Yet his eyes remained thoughtful, distant. For all its neatness, the story did not satisfy. He had seen too many crimes dressed in convincing garments, their seams only visible to those who looked beyond the surface. That evening, Grayson was summoned to the drawing room, where the constable confronted him with the letters. The butler stood tall, his face ashen but steady. "I served the Ashwoods faithfully for 30 years, he said, his voice low. "If my loyalty counts for nothing now, then so be it. But I swear before God, I did not harm my mistress." "Lise," the constable barked. "You quarreled with her. You knew of her fears. You had every chance." Archer watched Grayson carefully. The man's eyes were resolute, but there was no flare of indignation, no desperate defense. Instead, there was a wary acceptance, as though he had expected such a fate. That, more than anything, unsettled Archer. The guilty fought to the last. Only the innocent resigned themselves. Nevertheless, under the constable's authority, Grayson was taken into custody. The news spread quickly, and by nightfall the village tavern was alive with talk of justice served. Ashwood Manor fell into a strained quiet, the remaining servants moving about their duties with a brittle kind of relief. For the first time since Lady Margaret's death, the house breathed as though its ghost had been exorcised. Yet Archer could not share their ease. He returned once more to the drawing room. Standing where Lady Margaret had been found, he looked at the serpent-handled letter opener, now sealed away in evidence. He looked at the note propped against the clock, its words still etched into his mind. "The serpent will return to its nest." If Grayson were the serpent, then why had Lady Margaret written those words? They sounded less like an accusation than a warning, as though she expected someone, or something, to return. Grayson had not returned. He had been present all along. The logic did not fit. He studied again the smear beneath her chair, where the weapon had been placed before being staged. If Grayson had killed her, why bother with such theatrics? Why not strike quickly? Leave her where she fell? The tableau reeked of artifice, of a mind intent not only on killing but on creating a message. And Grayson, for all his silence, was not a man of riddles. The next morning, Archer tested the window again. The small muddy print remained, faint but undeniable. He crouched, tracing its outline with his gloved hand. It was too small to belong to Grayson, too narrow for his heavy frame. It fit Ellen more closely, or perhaps even the cook, though her size made climbing through improbable. Someone else had been here, someone whose presence the constable dismissed as impossible. That same day, Thomas came to Archer privately, his eyes darting about nervously. "Sir," he whispered, "they say Mr. Grayson will hang. But it wasn't him." "Hey, he couldn't have." Archer studied the boy closely. "And how would you know that, Thomas?" The footman bit his lip, then looked away. "Because I saw him. After I left the pantry, I passed him on the stairs. That was minutes before Ellen screamed. He couldn't have been in the drawing room then." It was a statement that should have shattered the constable's case. Yet Thomas's hesitation gave Archer pause. Was he telling the truth or shielding someone else? And if he shielded Ellen, as Archer suspected, then the lie was as dangerous as silence. Still, the contradiction was enough to confirm Archer's unease. The constable's neat solution was a false victory. The serpent had not been caught, it had only shed its skin. By evening, Archer wandered the manor in silence, listening again to the house breathe. He thought of Lady Margaret, seated rigid in her chair, her eyes wide with something more than fear. She had expected death. She had written her message not in despair, but in warning. She had known the serpent's return. And yet she had welcomed her fate in that locked room, as though the door had closed not against an enemy, but against inevitability. Archer returned to the library, spreading the letters once more across the desk. The words of Lord Henry came back to him. "The serpent coils even in our own house." Lady Margaret had kept these letters hidden, but not destroyed. She had burned others, Archer was certain, as the ashes in the grate attested. Why preserve these? Unless she wanted them found, pointing the way forward for the one who would look beyond appearances. The constable would report his success, the village would rest easier, and Grayson would sit in his cell awaiting judgment. But Archer knew the truth was still out there, coiled within the manor's walls. The serpent had not yet struck its final blow. And when it did, he feared, the house would echo again with death. The false resolution hung over Ashwood like a fog heavier than the mist outside its walls. With Grayson in custody, the house exhaled. But to Archer it was the uneasy breath of a patient misdiagnosed. He lingered long after the constable departed, returning again to the desk where the bundle of Lord Henry's letters lay. Their ink, faded yet sharp, seemed to whisper across time. Words once overlooked pressed now with new insistence, their shadows longer than before. One phrase struck him differently as he reread it under the lamplight. "The serpent coils even in our own house." Not your house, not this house, but our house. It had not been written to warn Margaret alone. It had been a confession, a bond, perhaps even an admission of guilt between husband and wife. Whatever had haunted Lord Henry abroad, he believed its tendrils stretched back here, to Ashwood itself. Archer set the letters aside and sifted through the household ledgers he had borrowed from Grayson's careful archives. Most were dull records of wages, orders, repairs, but in the margins of one account from nearly 20 years earlier, he noticed a scrawled note in Lady Margaret's hand. Bridger, advance to be deducted. The cook's surname. Curious, Archer turned the page and found more such entries, advances made and left unsettled. Sometimes months apart, always accompanied by irritated remarks. The amounts were far larger than any cook's comfort could require. These were not loans of kindness. They were debts bound in silence. The discovery sharpened his memory of Mrs. Bridger's nervous verbosity, the way she had drowned her testimony in details to disguise one unspoken truth. She had not only relied on Lady Margaret's favour. She had depended on it for her very livelihood, perhaps even survival. And if Margaret had at last tired of covering for her, Bridger's entire world would collapse. But debts were not the only tie buried in the past. The following morning Archer summoned Thomas under the pretext of clarifying his statement. The boy, pale from sleeplessness, confirmed again that he had seen Grayson on the stairs. Archer let the silence stretch until Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Then he asked, in a voice casual as a whisper, "When did you and Ellen first walk together in the village?" Thomas's eyes widened. He stammered, then admitted, "Nearly a year ago, sir. We meant no harm." "No harm," Archer echoed, studying him. "And yet Lady Margaret discovered it, didn't she? She threatened to dismiss you both." The boy's flush betrayed the truth. He nodded miserably. "She said I was unfit for service. That Ellen had shamed herself. She would have cast us out without a reference. Ellen begged her to reconsider. She never forgave us for it. So there it was. Another thread winding into the web. But what unsettled Archer most was not the young lover's plight, but the timing. Margaret had known of their secret a year ago, and yet she kept them on, though with constant threat. It was not kindness but something darker. She had kept them in her service because they were vulnerable, because their fear made them pliable. She had bound her household not with affection, but with chains of debt, secrecy, and shame. Archer turned again to the letters that night, weighing Lord Henry's final cryptic line. The serpent had not been some enemy from afar, nor some isolated malice. It was the corruption of the house itself, a corruption woven from debts unpaid, pride wounded, and sins unacknowledged. Margaret had inherited her husband's serpent, lived with it, perhaps even wielded it, until at last it turned upon her. The final overlooked clue came not from parchment but from stone. As Archer walked the grounds in the morning fog, his boot struck a half-buried marker near the garden wall. Brushing the moss away, he read a name, Anne Bridger, 1897–1904. A child's grave, small and weathered, with flowers long dead at its base. The surname pierced through him with cold clarity. He asked Mrs. Bridger about it that afternoon. The cook froze, the knife in her hand trembling. "She was my daughter," she said hoarsely. "Taken by fever. Lady Margaret's mother saw to her burial. We had nothing then." But Archer sensed there was more. "Your husband?" he asked gently. "Gone," she muttered, eyes downcast. "Long gone. Left us before the girl died. I owed the Ashwoods everything after that. Lady Margaret never let me forget it." Her words unlocked another door. Here was the root of her endless debts. Her servitude, not merely financial but emotional, chained to a family that had once extended help only to wield it as power. And as Archer walked back through the manor's corridors, he realized that every servant bore a similar scar. Grayson, bound by loyalty twisted into unspoken devotion. Ellen and Thomas, bound by the threat of dismissal and disgrace. The cook, bound by grief and debt. Each past wound converged in the present crime. The serpent was not a person but a legacy. Lord Henry's letters were not merely warnings, but the map of how the Ashwoods ensnared those closest to them. Margaret had inherited not only her husband's estate, but his methods, his manipulations. And now she was dead at the hands of someone who had lived too long under that shadow. Yet Archer knew this revelation alone was not enough. The constable would see only debts and secrets, not a murderer's hand. But the detective also knew that when the past cast a shadow long enough, someone would step into it, thinking it would hide them. That was the serpent's nest Margaret had feared, the one that had grown, uncoiled, and finally struck. As dusk fell, Archer sat in the dim library with the letters spread before him, the candlelight dancing across their faded ink. The past was no longer silent. It spoke in every hidden connection, every debt, every betrayal long buried. Now he knew where to look and whom to press for the truth that still coiled unseen within Ashwood Manor. And he felt, with a certainty that chilled him, that the serpent was not finished yet. Inspector Archer understood now that the serpent was not a singular enemy, but a legacy of shadows born from debts, betrayals, and secrets that bound Ashwood Manor together like ivy choking stone. Yet to prove it, he needed more than connections and suspicions. He needed to watch the household unravel itself. And so, he resolved to set the trap not with brute questioning, but with something subtler. A play upon their fears, an unconventional trick to test which heart would falter when the past was conjured before their eyes. That evening he gathered the household once more in the drawing-room, this time under the guise of confirming final details before the constable's report. They filed in hesitantly, Ellen pale and hollow-eyed, Thomas tight, jawed with restless energy, Mrs. Bridger clutching her apron in her fists, and the air heavy with the absence of Grayson, now sitting in the constable's custody. Archer said nothing at first. He merely arranged the letters from Lord Henry on the table in a neat fan, and beside them placed the brass key he had discovered hidden in the clock. The servants shifted uneasily. Archer let the silence thicken until the room seemed to creak with it. Then, with deliberate calm, he spoke. Lady Margaret believed the serpent would return to its nest. She left her warning where she knew it would be found. What she did not know, perhaps, is that she also left behind a lock and a key. The serpent's secrets were not hers alone to carry. They are written here in these letters, and what they reveal cannot be hidden much longer. He tapped the letters once, and then folded his hands, watching. It was not the words themselves, but the suggestion that mattered. He had not yet read all the letters in detail. He could not know their full contents, but the mere presence of them was enough to stir old ghosts. He studied each face closely. Mrs. Bridger dropped her gaze instantly, her breathing quickening, as if the letters themselves might contain her debts, her history of reliance laid bare for all to see. Thomas frowned, confusion shading into fear, his glance flickering toward Ellen, as though begging her to remain silent. Ellen, however, gave herself away most starkly. Her hands flew to her lap, clasping tightly, and her lips moved as though whispering a prayer. Her reaction was not to debt or disgrace, Archer saw, but to something more personal, something she knew the letters might expose. He pressed the advantage, his voice low, steady, almost hypnotic. These letters speak of betrayal. They name those who profited from Lord Henry's weakness, those who carried his corruption into this house. The serpent is not only among us, it has been with us all along. I will read them aloud now, unless someone wishes to spare the rest of you the shame of hearing what was written. The silence was a knife's edge. No one spoke, but their bodies betrayed them. Thomas's leg jiggled uncontrollably. Mrs. Bridger's lips worked without sound. And Ellen's knuckles whitened until Archer half feared she would draw blood. He turned his gaze to her deliberately, then opened one of the letters with slow precision. This one, he said, is dated the year before Lord Henry's death. He writes of a servant, trusted but treacherous, who knew too much of his dealings. He warns Margaret to keep watch, for this serpent may coil close to the family itself. He had not yet read that line. It was an improvisation, a fabrication designed to see who would stir. And stir they did. Ellen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The sound broke through the thick silence like a crack of thunder. She stammered. "It isn't true. I would never." The room turned toward her in collective shock. Thomas reached to steady her, but it was too late. Her words had burst forth unbidden, a confession not of guilt but of knowledge. Archer closed the letter without finishing, his eyes fixed upon her. "I never said the serpent was you, Ellen," he said softly. Her breath caught, her body stiffening as though struck. In that instant Archer knew he had pierced the veil of her deception. She had carried knowledge all along, perhaps even witnessed the crime itself. But fear had shackled her into silence. The serpent, whoever it was, held her fast. He dismissed the others soon after, leaving Ellen trembling by the door. "Stay a moment," he said gently, when the room had emptied. She obeyed, her eyes glistening, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. "You saw more than you admitted," Archer said quietly. "At the window, perhaps, or in the hours before. You've shielded someone because you fear what will come if you speak. But know this. Lady Margaret's death is not a burden you can carry in silence. The serpent strikes again when fear is fed." Her tears spilled then, silently, unchecked. She shook her head but did not speak, and Archer did not press her further. He had learned long ago that confession was a fragile flower, coaxed by time, not plucked by force. Instead, he left her with the letters on the table, the suggestion of their damning words lingering in the air. Later, alone in the library, Archer considered what her reaction revealed. The serpent was not Ellen, but Ellen knew who it was. The letters themselves might not have named anyone at all, yet the fear they inspired had pried open the first crack in her silence. It was enough. The path forward was clear. He must find a way to free Ellen from the grip of whoever held her in terror. Only then would she reveal the truth of what she had seen at the window, and with it the serpent's true face. But as he doused the lamp, and the house fell again into uneasy quiet, Archer could not shake the chill that crept over him. The serpent was cornered now, aware that its shadow had been glimpsed. And a serpent, when cornered, did not hesitate to strike. The crack in Ellen's composure lingered with Archer long after the household had retired, and though he felt the first glimmer of truth within reach, he knew better than to press her too hard. Fear had bound her silence, and fear could bind it still. If he was to break that chain, he would need patience and proof. The letters, the key, the smear by the chair, each was a thread leading into the heart of the serpent's nest. But threads, once noticed, could be cut. When morning came, he returned to the library, where the letters had been spread across the desk the night before. At first he thought his memory had betrayed him. The papers lay neatly stacked, but thinner than he recalled. He untied the ribbon, leafing through the faded pages, and his blood ran cold. One was missing. Not just any letter, but the one with the cryptic line about the serpent within the house. He searched the table, the drawers, even the floorboards, but it was gone. Archer summoned Grayson's understudy, a thin youth named Oliver who served as clerk and assistant. "Who entered this room last night?" he asked. "No one, sir. I locked it myself after you left." "Then you failed to notice the lock was turned with a second key," Archer replied. Tapping the brass one in his pocket, he knew at once this was no oversight. Someone in the household had braved the risk to steal that letter, and the intent was clear: to sever the link between past and present before he could reveal it. The discovery threw the manor into unease once more. He said nothing to the constable, who would dismiss it as irrelevant, but the knowledge spread quickly all the same, whispered from servant to servant. Each denial rang with too much eagerness, each protest with too much force. Ellen would not meet his eyes at all. That evening he inspected the drawing room again, his gaze falling on the letter opener, now sealed in a glass case. The constable had left it with the village magistrate as evidence against Grayson. But even that proof seemed suddenly fragile. Too easy to tamper with, too easy to mislead. A serpent clever enough to twist fear into silence would not hesitate to twist steel into deceit. And his suspicion was confirmed 2 nights later when Thomas came stumbling to him after dusk, his face pale as candle wax. Sir, you must come. The drawer, the case, it's empty. Archer followed him swiftly to the magistrate's office, where the glass was indeed intact, but the letter opener inside had vanished. The magistrate swore he had touched nothing. The constable fumed and swore that Grayson's allies must have acted, but Archer knew the truth was subtler. This was no rescue of an innocent man. It was the serpent coiling tighter, stripping him of every weapon he possessed. The household's nerves frayed with every hour. Ellen grew more fragile, her eyes shadowed with terror. Thomas shadowed her steps, protective but powerless. Mrs. Bridger retreated deeper into her kitchen, her words few, her hands trembling over the pots. Even Oliver, the clerk, confessed in a whisper that he felt someone followed him through the corridors at night. Ashwood was no longer merely haunted by death. It was actively consumed by it, every echo of the past clawing at the present. Archer remained outwardly calm, though inside he felt the serpent's breath. Someone within the house had risked everything to steal both the letter and the weapon. And that someone had the cunning to move unseen. He could not trust the constable, blinded by his determination to see Grayson hang. He could not trust the household, each bound by secrets too dangerous to name. He was left with only his own vigilance and the knowledge that the serpent, emboldened, might strike again to bury its truth once and for all. Late that night he set his own trap. He placed the remaining letters upon the library desk once more, spreading them in plain sight beneath the lamplight. Then he retired ostensibly to his chamber, but instead returned silently to the shadows of the corridor, waiting. Hours passed, the house sinking into silence, until at last he heard the faintest creak of hinges. A figure slipped into the library, cloaked in darkness, their steps swift, urgent. Archer strained to see, but the lamplight revealed only the edge of a sleeve, the glimmer of pale hands rifling through the papers. He stepped forward, but the intruder sensed him too soon. In a blink the letters scattered, the lamp toppled, and the figure darted for the corridor. Archer gave chase, but the manor's maze of halls worked against him. The shadow vanished into the servants' stairwell, leaving only the overturned lamp and the stink of burnt oil behind. When he gathered the letters once more, his heart sank. 2 more were gone. The serpent was not only cunning, it was desperate. Someone in Ashwood was fighting with all their strength to erase the past before Archer could unearth it. Every piece of evidence lost tightened the noose around the wrong neck, Grayson's, and deepened the danger for the one person who still carried the truth in her eyes. Ellen's silence could not hold much longer, but if the serpent struck again, it might be her voice that was silenced forever. Archer swore then, quietly, as the candles guttered in the draughty corridor, that he would not let the trail be extinguished. Evidence could vanish, steel could be stolen, letters burned, but fear left its mark upon flesh and bone. And fear, once named, could be broken. The serpent thought itself safe in shadow, but shadows could betray, and he would force them to. The game had changed. This was no longer a contest of deduction alone. It was war, silent and relentless, fought within the walls of Ashwood. And as Archer returned to his chamber at last, he knew one thing with icy certainty. The serpent had revealed its hand too soon, and desperation was a weakness he would exploit. The manor was uneasy with silence when Archer awoke that morning. Yet the quiet was deceptive, a brittle veneer over the tension thickening in every corner. He had not slept well. The theft of the letters and the disappearance of the letter opener gnawed at him. And Ellen's fear lingered like a shadow at his shoulder. Even as he moved through the halls for his morning rounds, he felt the air electric, charged with an invisible menace. Ashwood Manor was not yet at rest. He found the first sign in the morning room. The curtains were drawn tight, and a faint smell of smoke clung to the air. On the hearth, the remnants of a burnt document smouldered in the ashes. Archer knelt and sifted through the blackened remains, his eyes narrowing. Someone had tried to destroy what little evidence remained. But in the charred fragments, he glimpsed what had been a draft, perhaps another of Lady Margaret's letters, or notes pointing to the identity of the serpent. The villain's desperation was escalating, and with it, the danger. He moved quickly through the manor, seeking signs of Ellen or Thomas, but found the girl's chamber empty. A folded note lay on the bed, hastily written, "Do not follow. They will kill you if you try." The handwriting was familiar, trembling with fear. Archer clenched his jaw. Someone had taken her while he slept, exploiting her silence, her knowledge, and now her vulnerability. He wasted no time in alerting the constable, though he knew the man would be more concerned with Grayson than with the girl's safety. Archer ignored the constable's protests and raced through the corridors, tracing every footstep, every faint impression in the dust. The morning mist swirled against the windows as though conspiring to hide what he sought. Outside, in the garden, he found the first concrete clue. A faint trail of footprints leading toward the overgrown orchard at the edge of the estate. The prints were small, delicate, undoubtedly Ellen's. And yet another set overlapped, larger, heavier, less careful. Archer's pulse quickened. The serpent had been there, close enough to guide her away or seize her entirely. He followed the path, the fog thickening with each step. Branches clawed at his coat, and the wind carried the sound of a bird startled from its perch. As he approached a clearing, the unmistakable glint of metal caught his eye. A fragment of the brass letter opener lay embedded in the mud, bent almost beyond recognition. It had been hurled or dropped in haste. Someone was fleeing, and they had left a trace. Archer's instincts sharpened. The theft of evidence had been only the opening gambit. Now the serpent was moving, using terror to manipulate, to cover its tracks. And Ellen's disappearance proved it the villain was willing to escalate, willing to strike before Archer could expose them. He had no time for careful deliberation. As he pressed forward into the orchard, he caught sight of movement between the trunks. A figure darting toward the shadows. Archer called out, but the figure vanished. The forest's dense undergrowth swallowed it, leaving only silence and the faint imprint of hurried footsteps. He noted the direction and quickened his pace, when knowing that time was critical. Returning to the manor briefly to gather reinforcements, he found the household assembled in alarm, the cook wringing her hands, Thomas pacing frantically, and Grayson's absence weighing like a shadow over them all. Archer explained little, ordering a search of every corridor, every outbuilding, while he retraced the footprints with sharp eyes. He sensed that whoever held Ellen intended to move her out of reach, perhaps to a location familiar only to themselves. By late afternoon, he had tracked the trail to an old, abandoned gardener's cottage at the far edge of the estate. The door hung ajar, hinges creaking in the wind. Archer paused, listening. Inside, a muffled sob reached him, a sound he recognized immediately. Ellen. She had not been harmed yet, but the fear that gripped her was palpable even through the door. He entered quietly, stepping over debris and shattered boards. The room was sparse, save for a chair tipped over and a small desk where the intruder had clearly rifled through drawers. Ellen cowered in the corner, clutching her knees. Archer's approach was calm but deliberate. "Ellen, it's safe now," he whispered. Her relief was immediate but fragile. They threatened me," she stammered. "They said if I spoke, I would." She could not finish. Archer steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. "I understand. Tell me everything slowly, from the beginning." As she spoke, the picture began to clarify. She had indeed seen the intruder in the corridors, the night the letters and opener were stolen, had recognized the same person who had cornered her, and had been lured out of the manor with threats that Archer now understood to be the villain's preferred method: isolation, fear, and confusion. Every precaution had been calculated to make her hesitate, to paralyze her with terror before the truth could be revealed. Archer's mind raced. The serpent was methodical, bold, and several steps ahead, manipulating the household with uncanny precision. He now faced not only the task of solving Lady Margaret's murder, but of anticipating and preventing another act before it could be executed. This was no longer a pursuit of deduction alone, it was a battle against a mind as cunning as it was cruel. With Ellen safely returned to the manor under Archer's watchful eye, he instructed Thomas to remain with her, to provide comfort, but also to observe. The cook and Oliver were ordered to remain indoors, their movements supervised. Every window, every door, every passageway now became a potential threat. The detective knew that the serpent's patience had limits, and that the next move would come swiftly, perhaps before the night ended. Alone once more in the library, Archer spread the remaining letters before him, mapping their contents against the known movements of the household. A pattern emerged, one not of opportunity alone, but of deliberate targeting. Each act of fear, each stolen letter. Each threat had been calculated to misdirect him, to protect the true villain and divert attention from the real serpent coiled somewhere within Ashwood Manor. He realized then that the attack had not been random. It had been a test, a statement, a declaration of power. The serpent was not content with hiding. It sought to control, to manipulate the investigation, to dictate the pace at which truth could emerge. And yet in its arrogance lay its vulnerability. The very methods that had allowed it to remain unseen, the fear, the manipulation, the theft, also left a trail, subtle and precise, waiting for a mind attuned to human nature to follow. As night fell, Archer lit the lamp at his desk, the letters casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. He knew the serpent had revealed itself through its own actions, more clearly than any confession or clue could have. Ellen's fear, the vanishing evidence, the stolen letter opener, all were signposts, markers of intent and location. He leaned back, resolved and focused. The next hours would be crucial. The serpent's next move would be decisive, and Archer would be ready, not just to uncover the murderer, but to prevent the final act that might claim another life. Ashwood Manor was no longer merely a house of secrets, it had become a battlefield, and every shadow now held the promise of revelation or disaster. The hunt, he knew, was far from over, and the serpent was still several steps ahead, but its arrogance had given him a foothold. And in the quiet, flickering lamplight, Archer prepared to strike. The manor's silence that night was heavier than ever, weighed down by fear, the theft of evidence, and Ellen's trembling presence under Archer's watch. He had stationed Thomas in her chamber, not just for comfort but for observation, while the cook and Oliver had been relegated to supervised quarters. The household moved through its duties with measured caution, every glance and gesture a potential signal. Yet amidst the tension, Archer's mind churned, sorting through letters, fragments of overheard conversations, and the movements of the previous nights. The serpent had left traces, small and subtle, and he was determined to trace them. It was a minor remark, almost lost in the din of the household, that drew his attention first. Mrs. Bridger, while preparing a simple meal in the kitchen, muttered to herself as she arranged the utensils, "He always did like the spoons on the left, never the right." At first, Archer ignored it, filing it as the eccentricity of a nervous servant. But the words returned to him that evening, haunting in their precision. Lord Henry's letters, the thefts, Ellen's abduction. Could there be a rhythm in the details? A habit, perhaps, that the serpent depended upon? Archer began to review every movement in the manor, mapping each intrusion and misdirection against the household's routines. The theft of the letter opener, the disappearance of Ellen, the burned fragments of letters, all occurred at times when only a few people had access. Yet someone had exploited the smallest patterns in their behavior. And then he noticed it, a sequence overlooked, because it seemed mundane. Every time the serpent struck, it did so near the hearth, and always immediately following a minor lapse in attention from the staff. An unlocked door, a step too quiet, a momentary glance away. The villain had learned to observe habits, exploiting them with precision. He revisited the scene of the initial crime. Lady Margaret's chair, the smear on the floor, the cryptic note. Everything seemed staged, as if designed to mislead the eye of an ordinary observer. But with the new perspective, Archer noted how the objects were placed in relation to the room's natural lines of movement. The letter opener, the chairs, even the small inkpot on the desk, had been positioned not randomly, but according to someone who understood where eyes would naturally fall, who understood the habits of those who would later search for clues. The serpent had created a map for himself within the room, and in doing so, revealed his own tendencies. Archer turned his attention back to Ellen. As he sat with her quietly, he noticed a pattern in her speech. The way she referred to times and places, how she described movement through the corridors. One small detail struck him. She consistently mentioned seeing shadows move toward the eastern wing of the manor, yet she had never spoken of the western wing, where the initial thefts had been discovered. It was a habit of observation, not deliberate but telling. She had noted the direction the intruder took, unconsciously revealing where the serpent preferred to act, the areas he considered safest for concealment. The revelation came fully when he examined the letters once more. There was a recurring reference, often glossed over, to the clock in the drawing room, the brass key, the folded note, the placement of the letters. Each mention seemed innocuous, almost casual, until he aligned it with the movements of the intruder. The serpent had returned to that clock repeatedly, relying on the patterns of the household to cover his actions, and in doing so, he had left a consistent trail, a rhythm dictated by habit, not chance. Archer's mind raced through the sequence of thefts and misdirections. Each act of sabotage, the stolen letter, the burned fragments, the disappearance of the letter opener, was connected by small, almost imperceptible details, a slight creak in the floorboards, a door left unlatched. A pattern in the household's routine. The serpent had relied upon these tiny constants, assuming no one would notice, yet they now illuminated the path. He returned to the garden, where he had first followed the footprints to the orchard. Inspecting the undergrowth, he found another detail, previously dismissed. A series of small scratches on the bark of a tree, spaced at regular intervals. At first, they appeared as the random work of a squirrel or weathering. But in the context of the pattern, Archer recognized them as markers, a sequence guiding movement from the manor to the orchard. The serpent had not just moved within the house, he had mapped the grounds, marking them subtly for himself. Piecing it together, Archer realized that the entire series of crimes had been guided by observation and habit, not brute force or improvisation. The key to the case had been in plain sight all along the minute, consistent behaviors that the serpent relied upon to manipulate events. He had tracked Ellen, traced stolen evidence, and anticipated misdirection, yet the true advantage lay in noticing the mundane, the habits, the preferences, the unconscious routines. With this understanding, Archer formulated his plan. He would use the serpent's own reliance on habit against him, predicting where he would strike next. The key was the clock, the orchard, the repeated sequences in timing and movement. By controlling those elements, he could anticipate the intruder's actions, protect Ellen, and reclaim the stolen evidence. He summoned Thomas and Ellen that evening, explaining with careful clarity the importance of observation and consistency. They would need to act as extensions of his awareness, monitoring the household's patterns and reporting any deviation immediately. Every door, every hallway, every routine became a potential signal. The serpent had depended upon these routines. Now Archer intended to use them to lure him into exposure. Even as he spoke, the detective felt a chill. The serpent was aware, cunning enough to change tactics at the slightest hint of detection. But in the small details, Archer had the leverage. The handwriting on the letters, the placement of objects, Ellen's observations. They all formed a lattice of clues pointing toward the villain. One small misstep could give him the advantage he needed. As night deepened over Ashwood Manor, Archer positioned himself in the drawing room, eyes scanning the eastern wing and the shadows beyond the windows. He had arranged the letters, the brass key, and the remaining evidence precisely where the serpent would anticipate them, creating the illusion of vulnerability. The house, tense and silent, waited with him. The pattern was set, and the trap, invisible yet inevitable, had begun to close. The serpent had always acted several steps ahead. But even a master of cunning could not escape the consequences of predictable habits forever. Archer knew that when the intruder appeared, he would reveal himself, not through force, but through the very behaviors he had relied upon for months. The key, Archer realized, was not in chasing the villain blindly, but in understanding the rhythm of his mind. And as the manor breathed around him, quiet and expectant, Archer understood that the final confrontation was no longer a question of if, but when. Every habit, every minor detail, every overlooked observation now formed a lattice through which the truth could be captured. The pattern had emerged, and with it, the first glimpse of the serpent's inevitable downfall. Archer had spent the better part of the night watching, listening, noting. Yet the serpent remained careful, almost theatrical in its patience. But as the first grey light of dawn crept over Ashwood Manor, he felt the first stirrings of clarity. Every movement, every theft, every threat had been deliberate, but not merely to cover guilt or gain advantage. The motive, he realized, was not superficial, it ran deeper, twisted through years of fear, resentment, and obsession. He reviewed Ellen's account again, noting how she had described each intrusion, each glance from a shadowy figure. The consistency, the subtle clues in her storytelling, allowed Archer to reconstruct the sequence of events from a perspective neither the constable nor the household could grasp. And then, one detail struck him with quiet force. The intruder had always avoided the western wing of the manor, the wing Margaret had inherited directly from her mother, where the portraits of ancestors hung like silent sentinels. No theft, no disturbance. Only the eastern wing and its corridors, where servants lived and the household secrets had been quietly accumulated over generations. It clicked. The crime was not simply about debt, fear, or opportunistic murder. The serpent had targeted Lady Margaret not because of wealth or status alone, but because of the house itself. She represented continuity, a line of authority and vigilance that had constrained the serpent, bound him under the guise of obedience and subservience. The letters, the stolen items, the threats, they were all attempts to erode her control, to destabilize the legacy she had inherited, leaving a void the villain could fill. Archer's thoughts turned again to Mrs. Bridger and the old grave in the garden. The loss of her daughter, the debts, the reliance on the Ashwoods, all of it had created a fertile ground for resentment and obsession, but it was not enough to explain the meticulous cruelty of the serpent. Then he remembered another detail. A folded scrap of parchment discovered among Grayson's belongings before his false arrest. It was a fragment, a note written in haste. "She cannot control what she cannot see. They will vanish, and I will remain." It was then Archer understood the true motive was control. Absolute and psychological. The serpent had never sought mere revenge or fortune. He craved dominion over the house itself, over the lives of those who lived within it, manipulating them through fear and silence. Every act, every theft, every disappearance had been a calculated step toward erasing Lady Margaret's authority and bending Ashwood Manor to his will. He gathered Ellen once more, speaking gently yet firmly. "You've observed more than you realize," he said. Her nod, hesitant and fearful, confirmed it. "The person who took you, who stole the letters, who orchestrated these thefts, he is not motivated by money or simple malice. He seeks to dominate the house, to control its legacy and everyone within it. That is why he has struck so carefully, so methodically. Every act is part of a larger design." Her eyes widened in terror. "All this time, it wasn't just to frighten me." "No," Archer said. "It was to assert power, to manipulate every heartbeat in Ashwood Manor. He needed silence, obedience, and fear. The moment you faltered, he gained an advantage. But every move he makes leaves a mark. He cannot erase his presence completely. That is why the letters, the clock, even the footprints in the orchard, they matter." He reviewed the movements again, now with this revelation in mind. The pattern became startlingly clear. The serpent's attacks were not random. They were psychological experiments, testing the limits of fear and loyalty within the household. Each theft, each threat, each disappearance had been designed to provoke specific reactions, to measure compliance, to observe which individuals could be bent and which resisted. The villain's mind was both brilliant and twisted, obsessed with control, and unafraid of committing murder to achieve it. The true shock came when Archer linked the motive to one of the most overlooked details, the brass key hidden in the clock. It had been dismissed as a mere curiosity, a minor oddity, but now it revealed its significance. The key did not merely open a drawer or a cabinet. It symbolized the serpent's belief that control of Ashwood required access to secrets, both written and hidden. By stealing, moving, and threatening, he had attempted to turn that key into a weapon of dominance. The thefts, the letters, Ellen's abduction, all were part of a single, coherent psychological strategy aimed at asserting that dominion. Archer realized the villain's audacity was rooted in obsession. Every action was premeditated to destabilize, every interaction calculated to provoke fear. Money, status, or revenge were incidental. The crime was a manifestation of the serpent's need to manipulate, to control, and ultimately, to eradicate anyone who could oppose him. Lady Margaret's death had been inevitable in this context, not because of a quarrel over wealth or inheritance, but because she represented resistance, the final barrier between the villain and complete dominion over Ashwood. He also noted the emotional subtleties. Ellen's reactions, Mrs. Bridger's anxiety, Thomas's protective instincts. All had been observed and leveraged by the villain, shaping their behavior to create confusion and isolation. The pattern was not merely in stolen objects or letters, it was in human psychology itself. The serpent had weaponized fear, timing, and habitual observation, manipulating the manor's inhabitants as pieces on a board. Archer's pulse quickened as he connected one final detail. The timing of the crimes coincided with the household's routines, but also with private grievances and vulnerabilities. The serpent had exploited not only the habits, but the insecurities of those within Ashwood. He understood now that the villain's cruelty was intimate and precise. Each action had a dual purpose: to gain advantage and to satisfy a deeper, perverse satisfaction in exerting power over the lives of others. As the sun rose over the manor, casting long shadows across the corridors, Archer felt a clarity he had not experienced until now. The crime was not simply an act of passion or greed. It was the manifestation of a mind consumed with control. And with this revelation, he knew the next steps. To confront the serpent, to protect Ellen, to recover the stolen evidence, he would have to anticipate the villain's obsession, predict his manipulations, and act with precision. He called Ellen and Thomas to him once more, instructing them to remain vigilant yet calm. "The serpent relies on fear to control you," he explained. "Do not give him that advantage. Watch, but do not react impulsively. Every small detail is important. Every routine is a signal." With the household now aware, cautiously, of the villain's true intent, Archer prepared himself. The hidden motive, a desire not for wealth, but for absolute psychological dominance, had finally emerged. It was a revelation more chilling than any theft or murder, for it exposed the depth of cruelty lurking within Ashwood Manor. The serpent was not merely a criminal, he was a master manipulator, obsessed with power over minds as much as over the house itself. Archer sat in the library, surrounded by the letters, the brass key, and the remnants of disrupted order. He understood now that the game had changed. To end the serpent's reign, he would need to anticipate not just actions, but intent, to read the mind as well as the movements. The villain had exposed himself through pattern and obsession, but predicting his next move would require all of Archer's skill, patience, and courage. And as the wind stirred the trees outside, and the manor seemed to hold its breath, Archer felt the weight of the final confrontation approaching. The hidden motive had been revealed, and with it came both clarity and danger. Ashwood Manor's darkest hour was yet to come, and the serpent, long patient and calculating, would not yield without a final, desperate strike. Archer had spent the hours before dusk preparing with a careful, almost surgical precision. Every movement, every placement of letters, every candle and shadow in the drawing room was part of a plan designed to expose the serpent at last. He knew the villain would act predictably, guided by the same habits and obsession that had governed every theft, every threat, and every act of terror in Ashwood Manor. The key was patience and timing. One misstep now could cost Ellen, or worse, allow the serpent to vanish once more into the shadows. Ellen and Thomas were stationed nearby, hidden from sight but able to observe. Archer had instructed them to remain calm, to signal only with subtle gestures, and to be ready to intervene if the serpent attempted anything rash. Every corridor, every doorway, every glint of light was considered, mapped, and memorized. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, the walls whispering the secrets of past disturbances, waiting for the final act to unfold. As evening deepened, a flicker of movement caught Archer's eye. From the corner of the hall, where shadows pooled beneath the eastern wing, a figure slipped silently toward the drawing room. The footsteps were measured, familiar, calculated to avoid creaking boards, but not precise enough to conceal human intent entirely. Archer recognized the gait, the careful avoidance of certain tiles, the hesitation at the threshold. The serpent had arrived. He remained seated, outwardly calm, letting the intruder believe the room empty. As the figure stepped forward, Archer's eyes followed every motion, the deliberate glance toward the letters, the subtle check of the door behind, the tiny twitch of a hand as it brushed against the mantel. The villain had entered the trap, unaware that Archer had anticipated each instinct, each habitual motion. The serpent said finally, his voice smooth but edged with restrained fury. I wondered how long it would take before you caught on. He stepped fully into the light, revealing a face paler than the moon, eyes sharp and calculating, lips pressed into a thin, controlled line. I admire your patience, detective, but patience alone does not save the Narva from consequences. Archer did not rise. He observed. Every word, every tone, was a thread he could use. Consequences, he said quietly, almost conversationally. You mean the fear you've sown, the thefts, the threats. All of it calculated to dominate Ashwood Manor, to bend the household to your will. That's your game, isn't it? A flicker of something crossed the serpent's face. Anger, perhaps, or surprise that his motive had been deciphered. You understand more than you should, he said, his voice lowering. Yes. Control, power. It is not about money or revenge or petty spite. It is about order, my order. And no one, not Lady Margaret, not these children, not even the law, could stand in the way of that order. Archer's gaze held him, steady and unflinching. And yet here you are, he said, exposed, trapped by your own habits. Every theft, every threat, every abduction, it all left traces. You relied on patterns, routines, human fear. Those same patterns brought you here, to the place where your control ends. The serpent's composure faltered, almost imperceptibly. He stepped toward the table, his eyes darting to the letters. Those letters are meaningless, he said. Fragments of a past that no longer matters. They cannot touch me now. Archer stood slowly, careful not to startle him, and pointed toward the door behind. Perhaps not. But the choices you've made, the obsessions that guide you, have made one thing certain: you cannot leave without revealing yourself. And that, my friend, is the one thing that will end your reign over this house. The serpent's fingers twitched over the table. For a moment he seemed poised to strike, but then he froze, realizing that every route of escape had been anticipated. Archer's careful positioning of the letters, the brass key, and the observation posts outside the room ensured there was nowhere to flee, no shadow large enough to hide in, no door unobserved. A tense silence filled the room. The serpent's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the corridors, then back at Archer. You think you have me, he said finally, a note of grudging respect in his voice. You have guessed my patterns, anticipated my moves. But do you understand why I acted? Do you comprehend the necessity of my measures? Archer leaned slightly forward. I understand more than you think. You acted to dominate, to manipulate, to erase anyone who could oppose you. Your fear was your weapon, your obsession the motive. And now, every step you take only tightens the net. For a heartbeat, the serpent wavered. Then he let out a soft, humorless laugh, the sound bouncing off the walls like dry leaves. So it comes to this, he said. I have gambled, I have planned, I have orchestrated. And yet, in the end the game is over. Archer's eyes narrowed. The game is not over until justice is done. The serpent's hand moved suddenly, not toward a weapon, but toward the drawer, where he hoped to reclaim a letter, perhaps to destroy it. Archer anticipated the movement instantly, closing the distance with careful speed. His hand caught the serpent's wrist, pinning it to the table. The brass key fell to the floor with a metallic clink, and Archer bent to pick it up. Holding it as a symbol of control wrested from the villain's grasp. "You underestimated me," Archer said, steadying the man with a firm grip. "Your obsession with control blinded you to one fact: control can be taken back. Patterns can be anticipated. Fear can be diffused. And every lie you've tried to hide now lies open for all to see." The serpent's shoulders sagged slightly, exhaustion and defeat visible in the lines of his face. You understand me," he whispered. "But understanding does not absolve, does it?" "No," Archer said quietly. "But it allows me to stop you from doing more harm. That is enough." He signaled to Thomas, who had remained concealed, and the young man moved quickly to the door, opening it for the constable and 2 officers who had arrived unseen, summoned earlier as part of Archer's plan. The serpent's gaze followed them, sharp but defeated, as the law closed in. He had gambled, calculated every detail, and yet every habit, every obsessive measure, had led him into the trap Archer had designed. As the officers took him into custody, Archer released his grip, stepping back to watch. The manor seemed to exhale, as if the walls themselves recognized the end of the threat that had haunted it for weeks. Ellen, Thomas, and even Mrs. Bridger emerged cautiously, faces pale but relieved, the tension that had gripped them finally loosening. Archer gathered the scattered letters and the brass key, setting them in order on the table. Each one told a story of manipulation, fear, and obsession. But together they also told the story of resolution. The serpent had relied on patterns, on psychological dominance, but it was the observance of detail, the patience of the detective, and the courage of those who had not succumbed to fear that had undone him. In the quiet that followed, Archer addressed Ellen and Thomas. "The house is safe now," he said. "Not because fear has disappeared, but because the control he sought has been broken. The serpent will not return, and the patterns that governed him are now his undoing." Ellen's voice trembled as she spoke. "It's over." "Yes," Archer said. "Over. And now the truth is finally free to be known, the evidence recovered, and Ashwood Manor restored to those who belong here. The serpent had been clever, relentless, and cruel, but in the end, his obsession with control, his reliance on predictable habits, and his need to dominate had become the very tools of his capture. Archer had anticipated, observed, and acted with calm precision, ensuring that justice was done and the shadows that had haunted Ashwood Manor were finally dispelled. And as the first light of dawn broke through the windows, painting the manor in soft gold, Archer knew that the nightmare had ended. Not by chance, not by force, but by the careful, unyielding application of reason, observation, and patience. Ashwood Manor could breathe again, and the widow's secrets would remain protected, her legacy restored, and the serpent's dominion finally ended. The manor seemed to breathe again in the wake of the serpent's capture. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, and even the ancient portraits seemed less oppressive, their eyes no longer shadowed by the threat that had stalked the corridors for weeks. Archer moved through the house, checking that Ellen and Thomas were settled, that the letters and key were secured, and that the constables had begun cataloguing the evidence with methodical care. Relief hung in the air like a fragile mist, yet Archer felt a small, nagging disquiet, a shadow of intuition that had never led him astray. It came as he was reviewing the letters, arranging them in the chronological order he had reconstructed. One fragment, almost overlooked in the chaos, made his brow knit. The ink was smudged, the handwriting uneven, yet familiar in an unexpected way. Archer frowned, comparing it to the serpent's letters. The curves, the flourishes, even the pauses in phrasing, all suggested a second hand, one that had gone unnoticed beneath the meticulous plotting of the villain he had just seen captured. He rose, pacing the library quietly, retracing every step of the investigation. The footprints in the orchard, the stolen letter opener, the burned fragments, Ellen's abduction. They all had a coherence now, a rhythm dictated by habit and obsession. Yet this fragment suggested a hidden influence. Someone who had orchestrated the events behind the scenes, manipulating even the serpent's moves. A shiver ran down Archer's spine. If there was a hidden puppeteer, the nightmare was far from over. He called Ellen and Thomas, showing them the fragment. "Look closely," he said. "This is not the serpent's handwriting. It is deliberate, but different. It suggests guidance, instruction. Someone else involved in these crimes. Someone who has remained unseen." Ellen's eyes widened. Another person," she whispered. "I thought it was only him." "Yes," Archer said. "But this letter hints at a more insidious design. Someone else has been orchestrating, pulling strings even while the serpent carried out the acts. We've captured a part of the plan, but not the whole." He returned to the drawing room, retracing every placement of evidence, every sequence of intrusion. Slowly, methodically, he realized something that had eluded him before. The serpent had not acted alone in all matters of timing. Certain thefts, certain threats, even the placement of letters in particular rooms, had required knowledge of movements and intentions he could not have had on his own. Someone had been feeding information, guiding his hands, ensuring that the pattern led Archer down one path, while leaving another untouched. Archer summoned the constable privately, showing him the fragment and explaining the implications. "This is more than a single villain," he said. "We've apprehended the visible hand. But there is another mind behind the scenes, orchestrating events. Someone within Ashwood Manor, or close enough to know its routines intimately, has remained hidden. We must identify them before more harm can be done." The constable, previously confident in his resolution, paled slightly. "You mean someone has been manipulating both of us?" he said. "Someone else?" "Yes," Archer said. "And they are clever." Every act of the serpent was influenced by this hidden presence. We need to consider who had both opportunity and motive. Who could remain unseen while controlling the movements of others? Archer's thoughts returned to the household. Everyone had been questioned, observed, and dismissed at some point. Yet in this new light, he reconsidered subtle details he had previously ignored, the way Mrs. Bridger lingered near the servants' quarters, the odd precision with which Oliver had kept track of keys and letters, even the seemingly innocuous comments of Thomas about small disturbances he had noticed but never mentioned. Each of these details now demanded scrutiny. He gathered Ellen and Thomas again, explaining the stakes. "We must examine the household with fresh eyes. Every habit, every word, every action may reveal the hidden manipulator. The serpent has been exposed, but the mastermind may still be in our midst. Someone we have trusted, perhaps someone we never suspected." They moved through the manor together, retracing every corridor, examining doors, cupboards, and hidden alcoves. Archer's eyes were sharp, scanning for the slightest inconsistency, the subtlest trace of manipulation. And then he noticed it. A faint smudge on the underside of the dining room table, a smattering of soot that did not match the fireplace's ash, and a pattern of indentation in the wood suggesting repeated use of a small implement. Archer knelt, examining the marks with the eye of a seasoned observer. The smudges and scratches formed a deliberate trail, one that could only have been created by someone who had access to the manor when others were asleep or distracted. The letters and fragments, the sequence of the serpent's actions, even the final abduction of Ellen, had all been subtly guided along this path. The handwriting, the smudges, the precise timing, all pointed toward an individual who had remained in the background, orchestrating each move, ensuring the serpent's compliance, and preserving the pattern for his own purposes. He paused, his mind racing. The handwriting, the smudges, the repeated manipulations, they all suggested an intimate knowledge of Ashwood Manor and its occupants. This was no opportunist. This was someone whose motives were personal, perhaps even obsessive. Someone who had been close to the household, observing and recording every detail, waiting for the right moment to act through the serpent's hands. As he rose, his gaze fell on Thomas, standing slightly apart, fidgeting with a keychain in his pocket, a habitual gesture Archer had noted but dismissed earlier. A sudden flash of recognition hit him. The timing, the access, the faint traces of influence. Could it be that Thomas himself, seemingly loyal and protective, had been guiding events in ways even the serpent could not anticipate? The thought shocked him, but the pieces began to fit in a terrifying new configuration. Archer called Thomas to him, his voice calm but firm. "There is one last thing we must clarify. The serpent acted under guidance. Someone has been influencing him, directing his actions. You were present for all of these events, observant of routines, access points, and letters. Can you explain this?" Thomas froze, the keychain clattering softly onto the floor. His eyes flickered, a mixture of fear and defiance crossing his features. "I only wanted to protect the house," he said finally, voice trembling. I never meant." Archer stepped closer, his tone unwavering. "Protection is one thing, manipulation another. Every stolen letter, every threat, every abduction, the pattern shows a guiding hand, one that used fear as a tool, orchestrated the serpent's moves, and remained hidden in plain sight. The question is, were your intentions protective, or something more?" Thomas's lips parted, but no words came. The constables stepped closer, sensing the tension, and Archer continued. "The evidence points to someone intimate with the household, someone who understood the routines, the habits, the fears. It points to someone who could control events without revealing themselves. Someone who has been hiding behind appearances all along." A long silence followed, the kind that stretched through the manor, heavy with the weight of revelation. Then, finally, Thomas spoke, voice barely audible. I thought I could manage it, that by guiding him, I could prevent worse harm. I never imagined it would spiral so far." Archer's gaze remained fixed, reading every tremor, every hesitation. The final twist had emerged. The true mastermind had not been the obvious villain at all, but someone long trusted, whose intentions had been hidden beneath loyalty and vigilance. The serpent had been a tool, manipulated to achieve ends that even he could not have foreseen. The manor seemed to shiver under the revelation, the air heavy with betrayal and shock. Archer understood now that his work was not yet complete. The case was no longer a matter of uncovering the serpent's crimes alone, but of addressing the deeper deception, the hidden motives, and the dangerous influence that had guided the chaos from within. The detective's genius, tested through observation, pattern recognition and psychological insight had revealed the final twist, but it also demanded one last act of reasoning, courage, and resolution to restore Ashwood Manor to safety and truth. And as the sunlight waned, casting long shadows through the corridors, Archer prepared himself to confront the unexpected mastermind, knowing that only clarity, composure, and an unerring eye for detail could bring the last chapter of this dark tale to a close. The air in Ashwood Manor was thick with tension, heavier than it had been during the serpent's capture. Archer stood in the grand library, the fading light casting long, sharp shadows across the rows of books. Thomas remained in the center of the room, his face pale, hands twitching slightly, as if he could not decide whether to speak or flee. Archer's eyes, sharp and unyielding, took in every detail, the slight tremor in Thomas's shoulders, the way he avoided direct eye contact, the subtle shifts in his weight that betrayed nervous calculation. "You have guided the serpent's hand from the shadows," Archer said quietly, his voice calm but unwavering. "Every theft, every threat, every disappearance, each was influenced by your knowledge, your decisions, your intimate understanding of this house. You believed yourself a guardian, but in reality you orchestrated chaos. The question now is whether your intentions absolve your actions." Thomas swallowed hard, his lips parting as he struggled to find words. I never meant anyone to get hurt. I only wanted to control the situation, to prevent him from doing worse. I thought I could contain it." Archer's gaze did not waver. "Contain it? You handed him the tools to terrorize this household, to abduct Ellen, to manipulate fear itself. You relied on him to act, and in doing so, you became the true mastermind. The serpent was your instrument, but your knowledge was the key. Without your guidance, the pattern would have faltered. The evidence would not have disappeared, and the chaos you hoped to prevent might never have arisen." The constables moved forward cautiously, sensing the gravity of Archer's revelation. Yet he raised a hand, signaling them to hold. This was not a matter of immediate restraint. The truth needed to be established, and the hidden mechanics of the deception exposed. Archer began to walk slowly around Thomas, pointing to details that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. "Consider the letters," he said, holding up the fragments still preserved. "Notice the sequence, the timing, the specific placement in rooms that were supposedly random. Only someone with knowledge of the household's routines could orchestrate this with such precision. The serpent may have executed the actions, but you directed them, consciously or unconsciously." Thomas's shoulders slumped, and a single tear escaped his eye. I thought I was protecting everyone," he whispered. "I didn't want the house destroyed or Ellen harmed." Archer knelt, gently picking up the brass key from the table and holding it between them. "Protection without accountability is only self-deception. You believed the serpent's obedience would suffice to safeguard Ashwood, but in reality, you handed him the strings that made him dangerous. The chaos was never in his hands alone. It was in yours as well." Thomas's gaze dropped to the floor. "So what happens now?" Archer straightened, his expression firm but tinged with the weight of understanding. "Now, justice must follow, even if it is uncomfortable. The law will decide your fate, as it must for all who manipulate, deceive, and endanger. But understand this: I have traced every action, observed every sequence, and deciphered every subtle clue that led to this moment. The serpent was a distraction, a decoy, and yet the lessons he left behind, every mark, every movement, have allowed us to see the truth hidden in plain sight." The constables advanced, carefully placing restraints on Thomas. He did not resist. The realization of exposure had sapped any energy for denial. Archer watched quietly, noting every hesitation, every subtle reaction, the same meticulous observation that had guided him through weeks of investigation. Even now, the detective's mind catalogued everything, anticipating the household's questions, Ellen's fears, and the repercussions of this final revelation. Yet even as Thomas was led away, Archer felt the subtle twinge of unease. The mastermind's motives had been revealed, but the psychological aftermath lingered. Fear, resentment, and obsession were not easily dispelled. The serpent had been contained, but the threads of manipulation, the intricate web of control, had been woven through the lives of the household. Some scars, he knew, would remain. He returned to the letters and fragments one last time, arranging them meticulously on the table. "Look closely," he said to Ellen, who had been watching in silence. These were overlooked, dismissed, or misread by others. Yet every detail matters: the timing, the placement, even the handwriting. The evidence was never lost, it was hidden in plain sight. That is the principle upon which this investigation succeeded. Observation, pattern recognition, and attention to human behavior have revealed the truth. Ellen nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. Saw the chaos, the fear, it was all guided. "Yes," Archer said. "Not by chance, not by random malice, but by intention." And understanding that intention allows us to correct the wrongs, restore the order, and ensure that Ashwood Manor is protected from further manipulation. But as the final light of day faded, casting long shadows through the corridors, Archer noticed a subtle detail. A small shift in one of the portraits, the faint glimmer of a key moved slightly from its place, almost imperceptible. His gaze sharpened. The pattern had been followed meticulously, the sequence observed, the mastermind revealed, but this tiny anomaly whispered that perhaps the web of manipulation was not yet fully unraveled. He rose, stepping carefully toward the corridor where the anomaly had caught his eye. "Even now," he said quietly, "we must remain vigilant. The serpent is gone, the mastermind exposed, and justice set in motion. But in cases such as this, one must never assume that every thread has been untangled. There may still be echoes, remnants of influence, or unobserved acts that could challenge the order we have restored." Ellen followed, her expression tense but resolute. "So it's really over?" Archer allowed himself a faint, measured smile. "It is over in terms of immediate threat?" "Yes. But the lessons remain. Observation, attention, and understanding human motives. These are the tools that allowed us to see what others could not. That knowledge, once lost, could allow chaos to return. We must never forget that." The constables led Thomas away, the serpent securely confined, and the household began the slow process of reclaiming its peace. Archer moved through the manor, checking each room, each corridor, and each detail he had catalogued. The tension of the past weeks lingered, but the knowledge that justice had been served, or at least begun, was a small comfort. As night fell fully over Ashwood Manor, Archer paused in the library, surveying the evidence, the letters, the brass key, and the quiet faces of those who had endured so much. The house, though scarred, was alive with cautious relief. He reflected on the final steps of the investigation, the missed details, the hidden motives, the subtle patterns that had revealed the true mastermind, and the careful orchestration that had brought both serpent and puppeteer into the light. Yet even in the resolution, Archer's mind remained alert. Justice had been served, or at least, it had seemed to be, but the unsettling notion that one detail, one subtle movement, one unnoticed pattern could yet escape notice lingered like a shadow across the manor. The case was closed, yet the lesson endured. In a world governed by observation and deception, one could never truly assume that all threads had been uncovered, that all dangers had been neutralized, or that the human heart would not reveal new secrets tomorrow. And so, as the manor settled into its first peaceful night in weeks, Archer allowed himself a moment of reflection. The serpent had been defeated, the hidden manipulator revealed, and the household spared further terror. Justice had been delivered. Yet even as he extinguished the lamps and moved toward rest, a quiet vigilance remained. The subtle knowledge that in mysteries such as these, the line between resolution and unfinished business is often thinner than one dares to admit. Archer walked slowly down the grand staircase of Ashwood Manor, the polished wood beneath his boots reflecting the soft glow of the lanterns. The house, though still tense from the revelations of the past days, was settling into a fragile calm. Ellen trailed behind him, her steps hesitant, the weight of recent truths pressing upon her. Even Thomas, now in the custody of the constables, had left a residue of unease. A reminder that the threads of manipulation had been more intricate than anyone had imagined. The detective paused briefly in the main hall, letting his gaze wander over the familiar portraits and tapestries. For all the resolution, the sense of closure was tempered by the subtleties he could not ignore. A shadow of movement, barely perceptible, seemed to flicker across the far corridor. He had learned long ago that Ashwood Manor had a way of hiding secrets in its walls, its corners, its almost imperceptible creaks and whispers. Even now, after exposing the serpent and unmasking the hidden manipulator, he sensed the house still held mysteries that had yet to be revealed. Ellen noticed the pause. "Are we really safe now?" she asked quietly, her voice betraying lingering fear. Archer turned to her, offering a faint, reassuring smile, though his eyes remained vigilant. "We are safer than before," he said. "The immediate threats have been neutralized. But a house like Ashwood, it remembers. It holds the traces of fear, of manipulation, of deceit. One must never assume that all shadows have been banished." They moved into the library together, and Archer ran a hand over the surface of the desk where the letters and fragments had once been spread. He noticed a faint crease in one of the older letters, one he had handled countless times before. It was almost invisible, like a whisper in paper. He straightened, examining it closely. The crease was not random. It suggested folding or concealment, perhaps even a message left for someone else. The serpent had been meticulous, the hidden manipulator careful. Yet the house itself seemed to conspire in hiding these subtle indicators, these breadcrumbs of further intrigue. Ellen leaned forward, curiosity mingling with anxiety. "Do you think there's more?" Archer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I do. Perhaps not the immediate threat of abduction or theft, but something subtler. A pattern, a hint, a shadow of intent that may have been overlooked. In cases like this, the smallest detail can hold the key to future events." He tapped the letter lightly, emphasizing the importance of observation. Even as we believe justice has been served, the human mind, and the human heart, does not always act in ways that are entirely transparent. Some secrets endure, waiting for discovery. As he spoke, Archer's eyes fell upon the small brass key, still resting on the edge of the desk. Its polished surface gleamed in the lantern light, and he picked it up again, turning it in his hand. The key had opened drawers, letters, and compartments before, but it had also symbolized more than mere access. It represented observation control and the passage between hidden and revealed truths. And yet, as he studied it, he wondered if it had also been used to conceal something more, something he had yet to uncover. He moved toward the window, looking out over the gardens, the orchard where the serpent had stalked, the hidden paths where evidence had been left and discovered. The manor, with its sprawling corridors and secretive corners, seemed alive, holding stories yet untold. Archer's mind catalogued possibilities: the misplaced letter, the overlooked routine, the subtle shift in a servant's demeanor that could signal the emergence of a new mystery. He felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the sensation that a puzzle was never truly finished until every element had been accounted for, and even then, there could be echoes of deception waiting in silence. Ellen followed his gaze, sensing the unspoken tension. "You think something might happen again?" she asked softly, a tremor in her voice. "Not necessarily," Archer replied. "But a detective's work is never done. Even when the obvious dangers are removed, the undercurrents, the motives, the obsessions, the desires that remain unspoken can give rise to new enigmas. The house teaches patience and the mind teaches vigilance. We have answered one set of questions, but the echoes of past actions often lead to new ones." He set the brass key down on the window ledge, his fingers lingering on it for a moment. The metallic weight was grounding, yet it also carried a hint of continuity, of unresolved threads. He thought of Thomas, the serpent, and the hidden manipulator, all of whom had acted according to their obsessions, their fears, and their desires. Patterns could be traced, predictions made, but human nature was never entirely predictable. There would always be anomalies, surprises, and the subtle deviations that led to fresh investigations. A soft breeze stirred through the slightly ajar window, rustling the curtains and carrying with it the faint scent of the gardens beyond. Archer inhaled deeply, allowing the familiar sensation of air moving through the house to remind him that life, though fragile, continued. He knew that Ashwood Manor, for all its grandeur and history, would always hold secrets. Some would remain buried, others would emerge only when the timing was right. A detective's vigilance, after all, was an unending endeavor. He turned to Ellen one last time, his gaze steady and calm. "You will find peace here," he said. "But remember this, even in quiet moments, a sharp eye and an attentive mind can reveal what others overlook. This house has taught us that, and it will continue to do so in ways both subtle and profound." As he walked toward the front door, preparing to leave the manor, Archer paused. His hand rested on the doorknob, and he glanced back at the long corridors, the portraits, the desk where letters and keys had revealed so much. One small scrap of paper, partially concealed beneath the rug, caught his eye. He bent down, lifting it carefully. It bore a single word, written in faint, deliberate ink: "Observe." A shiver ran down his spine, not of fear, but of anticipation. The message was cryptic, almost playful, yet unmistakably intentional. Someone, somewhere, had left this hint. Whether it was a leftover instruction from the hidden manipulator, a warning, or the beginning of another intricate puzzle, Archer did not yet know. But he understood immediately that the game was far from over. He straightened, tucking the scrap of paper into his coat pocket, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The manor stood behind him, quiet but alive, its windows reflecting the last light of the setting sun. Archer felt the familiar weight of expectation, the subtle thrill that only the unresolved could bring. A mystery had concluded. Yet another lingered just beyond the edge of sight, waiting to test observation, patience, and deduction once more. As he walked down the lane, leaving Ashwood Manor behind, he allowed himself a small, knowing smile. The case had reached its apparent conclusion. The serpent captured, the hidden manipulator exposed, the household spared further harm. But the whisper of "observe" reminded him that in the world of mysteries, the end was never absolute. Each solved puzzle led to new questions, each revelation to hidden truths, and each shadow to secrets yet untold. The night deepened around him, stars beginning to pierce the darkening sky. Archer's steps were steady, measured, confident. Ashwood Manor receded into the distance, yet in his mind, its corridors, its letters, its subtle clues, and its unresolved fragments remained vivid. A detective's work, he knew, was never truly finished, for the world was full of motives, obsessions, and secrets waiting patiently to be uncovered. And so, as the wind whispered through the trees and the manor's silhouette faded behind him, Archer continued on his path, alert, watchful, and ready. One mystery had ended, but another was already on the horizon, and he would meet it, as always, with unwavering observation, sharp intellect, and the calm certainty of one who knows that in the world of detection, a puzzle never truly closes, and the game never truly ends.